Graphics cards reviews often focus on comparing two GPUs running at the same settings and the same resolutions to get you their relative performance difference. However, that doesn't necessarily line up with how people would actually use a graphics card. And that's what we're looking at here. Let me freeze this for a second. So in this video, we're going to be focusing on the 4060. Whoa, did not mean to move that. I meant to move myself because I am a mouse pointer. Anyway, so we're looking at the 4060, which you can run at a variety of settings, against the 4070, which you can run at a variety of settings. And I think that in reality, it's not always that one GPU will get you a higher frame rate in a game. It's that you'll tune each GPU to get the frame rate you desire, and that will change the graphic settings at which you can achieve that. So here we're looking at the RTX 4070 can play Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, one of the best looking, most graphically demanding new games out there, at 1080p native, no upscaling, ultra settings, so you're maxing things out, and you're averaging in the mid-70s in a demanding combat zone. However, the RTX 4060, even turning down to high settings, would be under a 60 FPS average at those same settings. And again, that's already reduced down to high. Kicking on DLSS quality on the high settings, which at 1080p I don't love, the image looks a little bit softer, you're now actually hitting a very similar frame rate to what you were able to achieve at native 1080p ultra settings on the 4070. And so that's what I'm kind of getting at here. Is that when you look at the alternative way we could have done this, if I jump forward, and we'll definitely be doing this as well, you could see that we could just run both of them at 1080p Ultra, and then you'll see that the 4070 is averaging about 77 FPS versus 44 on the 4060. But that's telling you, okay, the 4060 can run in the 40s, and we can see that the 4070 is 75% faster at these settings. But what does that actually translate to? And that's where I think the previous screen is actually showing us more like how you might actually use each graphics card if you're trying to achieve kind of a high-ish frame rate experience for a first-person shooter style game, right? So in this video, we're definitely going to do a lot of the head-to-head at the same settings type stuff, but we'll also be breaking down if we need to. So what sort of head-to-heads would you get if we achieved a similar frame rate, but with the graphic settings being the variable, if that makes sense? Now, you might also be surprised at, wait, 75% faster on the RTX 4070? If I remember my launch reviews, that's a bigger gap than we should be seeing here. This is from 3D Center, and I'll link sources in the video description. This is pretty cool. So this is showing a whole bunch of major review outlets from their launch reviews for the RTX 4060. And then it's taking all of their averages and comparing them against different GPUs. So in other words, if you look at the 4060 set as a 100% performance baseline, and then look at the 4070, we're seeing that depending on the review outlet, you could have been seeing results anywhere from the 4070 being, 46% faster, or 64% faster, 52% faster, 58% faster. It's all over the place. The average from all of these major review outlets showed the 4070 as 57% faster. Now that's at 1080p rasterized performance in the review titles that they used. If you looked at ray tracing results, we would see it more like 66.5% faster, which is closer to what we're seeing here, and this is a ray tracing title, but also since launch, and also a lot of reviewers use kind of some older games and things like that. More new games go beyond 8 gigabytes of VRAM, which is what we're actually seeing happening in Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, especially at the higher settings, even at 1080p though. If we look at the green memory line here, and apologies that I didn't always have my settings set the same way on all of my stat counters when I ran these benchmarks, apologies. But if you look at the green memory line, which is at the bottom here on both of them, the GPU that has more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, that's the 4070, is showing a per process usage of about 9.5 gigabytes here, and a allocation for the game, GPU like VRAM allocation over 10 gigabytes. Now, the GPU with only 8 gigabytes of VRAM obviously can't use or allocate more than 8, but then, so in other words, that's probably contributing to why the 4070 is more than its standard amount faster than the 4060. But we'll see that in the latest games, which is what I'll be testing in this video, this is not an isolated incident of the 4070 being more than 70% faster than the 4060. Now, does that still mean the 4070 is better value? Well, if we look at the 4070 in current pricing, its original MSRP was $600, but it's been changed to $550 after it was supplanted at that price point by the 4070 Super. And now you can frequently find some models $10 or $20 below MSRP. Looks like if I was buying today, $540 is the lowest point. And the 4060 is available at its MSRP of $300 easily and is occasionally discounted $10 or $20 as well. Looks like we could find a couple models at $290. If we go by the lowest available new pricing, that means the 4070 currently costs 86% more money than the $290 4060. By the way, the models I'm reviewing in this video, on my 4070, it's the NVIDIA Founders Edition that I was sent as a review sample. And the 4060, there is no Founders Edition, so the review sample I was sent is in ASUS, is it the Tough Gaming OC? Pretty sure it is, but it's one of the, no, it's the dual OC, I think it is. Anyway. So the point is, they're both, fairly inexpensive kind of base model products. But yeah, so we're seeing this result. Let's go ahead and keep running through a variety of settings. I'm going to shrink myself down tiny unless I have too much to say. And again, what about 1440p? You might use either of those. You can see at 1440p, the 4070's lead grows to 83%. That's probably both a factor of even more of a VRAM issue, as well as possibly memory bandwidth, things like that. But neither GPU is doing amazing here. It's 53 versus 29. It's certainly a lot more playable on the 4070, but these still might not be the settings that you would be looking for. So if we go ahead and kick on DLSS quality, we see that now the 4070 is able to hit 82 FPS average, which is very, very usable, and DLSS quality looks pretty good at 1440p, so a lot of people would choose to play like this, whereas the 4060 is still only hitting 45 frames per second because it's both slower and is probably still running beyond its VRAM, which means it's having to spill into accessing system memory, which is slower. And so what if we drop down to high settings? Well, at high settings, the 4070 is 73% faster, so the 4060 closes a little bit of the gap, but not a lot, and it's 41 FPS versus 71. So if you were choosing to play without upscaling at 1440p, where now the 4070 would be doing very well here, but the 4060 would still need a little bit of help. Most people aren't going to play a first-person shooter at around 40 FPS, although you certainly could. So what are we looking at here? So once again, I'm looking at what would you really do? On the 4060, you'd probably have to go down to high settings with DLSS quality, and you can see we're now averaging around 60 FPS. Whereas on the 4070, you could be at native resolution at high settings and be averaging well over 60. Or you could even go ultra settings with DLSS quality and be averaging nearly 80 frames per second. So in other words, what are you really spending the more money on, right? It's really different graphics settings to achieve certain frame rates. What if we look at some Unreal Engine 5 options here? Lords of the Fallen is one of my most demanding Unreal Engine 5 games to test, and at 1080p Ultra, the 4070 is good for a little over 60 FPS at 65, whereas the 4060 is only good for 40 FPS. This gives the 4070 a 63% lead, so we can tell that it's less of a VRAM issue than we were seeing at on the Avatar game. And if we drop down to high settings, the 4070 is now leading by 57%. So again, when we're not in these VRAM-bound situations, the 4070 is not as dominant as it was, but it's still significantly faster. And we're seeing 88 versus 56 FPS here. So the 4060 is very playable at 1080p high, and the 4070 is giving you a nice high refresh rate experience. So what would you actually do? Again, on the 4060, you'd probably be playing at high settings at 1080p native resolution, but you could also go DLSS quality at high settings to get around 80 FPS average, whereas the 4070 could just go down to high settings at native 1080p, and not upscaling at 1080p would certainly be my preference, and now you're closing in on around 90 FPS. So certainly gives you quite a bit of an advantage there on what sorts of settings you could choose to get a high refresh rate experience and not having to upscale at 1080p to get a high refresh rate. At 1440p Ultra, we see neither GPU does great. It's 46 versus 27, so a 70% advantage to the 4070. So its percentage lead seems to gain when we go to the higher resolutions like 1440p. That's most likely related to memory bandwidth, if I had to guess. But neither one was doing great there. So one option is to stay at ultra settings but kick on DLSS quality, and the 4070 is now very comfortably at 73 FPS, whereas the 4060 is down in the mid-40s at 45. The 1% lows are a bit closer together, but that's related to traversal stutter. You'll notice as we round this bend, you'll see some spikes in the frame time graph, which isn't necessarily the GPU's fault. It's more of an Unreal Engine thing. But it looks like our 4060 needed to do something else. So we could try going down to the high settings, but that still doesn't really get us where we need to be on the 4060, which is only hitting 38 FPS, although the 4070 is averaging over 60 FPS at native 1440p by just reducing to the high settings. That's giving the 4070 a 68% advantage over the 4060, so a very, very noticeable lead here. So the 4060 would likely have to upscale, maybe even off the high settings as a baseline to hit 60 FPS average. Whereas the 4070 could play at a native high settings and average a very similar frame rate. Or you could even go up to ultra settings and use DLSS quality and actually be averaging over 70. So the 4070 has a lot more flexibility on how to play this, whether you want to play at native resolution with slightly reduced settings or max everything out with upscaling, all that type of stuff. Now, not every Unreal Engine 5 game is as demanding as Lords of the Fallen, so we could also look at RoboCop Rogue City, which is less demanding, and at 1080p Epic settings, we're seeing 89 FPS versus 56. We're seeing the 4070 taking a 59% lead here in the averages and a 51% lead in the 1% lows at 71 versus 47. On the 1080p high settings, so if we go down to high settings, the 4060 is now able to average over 60 FPS at 64, but now the 4070 is offering over 100 FPS average in the same scene at a 59% lead. The 1% lows are a 53% advantage at 81 versus 53. So, again, the 4070 is offering a lot more flexibility here. So how would you actually play the game? Well, on the 4060, you could go DLSS quality at Epic settings, which I don't love to use DLSS at 1080p. So if you want to stay at native settings, you could play at high settings, but now you're averaging a bit over 60 versus going around 80 if you kick on DLSS quality, whereas the 4070 could stay at native maxed out settings and be hitting a 90 FPS average. So I think you're getting a meaningfully better experience on that 4070 for sure. If we go up to 1440p resolution at Epic settings, we're getting a 72% average on the 72% average improvement over the 4060 on the 4070 at 62 FPS versus 36. And the 1% lows are 53 versus 32. So again, 4070 is over 60 FPS average, maxed out 1440p, and the 4060 was barely, in the upper 30s. If we kick on DLSS quality, it helps out significantly in Unreal Engine 5, which is very, resolution dependent for performance. And the 4060 jumps all the way up to 56 FPS. However, the 4070 jumps to 89, giving it a 59% advantage and a 43% lead in the 1% lows at 66 versus 46. So what are we going to do here? Another option would be to kick on frame generation. If you're near a 60 FPS mark, kicking on frame generation can be pretty reasonable. If you're below it, it can be questionable. You can see that the latency numbers do increase if you look at the bottom of the screen. But here, we also see the 4070 takes an 80% advantage over the 4060, possibly due to the additional VRAM, because kicking on frame generation does use VRAM. So having more can help out, because if you're already borderline on the VRAM usage, kicking on frame gen can be a bit rough. Now, if we go to 1440p and drop down to high settings, we'd be at 71 FPS on the 4070, whereas the 4060 is only at 42, giving the 4070 a 69% average over the 4060, which is, again, showing that 4070 is very comfortable at native 1440p high settings, and the 4060 wasn't. So how would you play these at 1440p? Maybe DLSS quality at high settings on the 4060 to achieve over 60 FPS, whereas the 4070 could be at native Epic settings and over 60 FPS. So if you're shooting for around 60 FPS, you can max things out natively on the 4070, whereas the 4060 would be both reducing settings and kicking on upscaling. Let's go ahead and take a look at Starfield. At 1080p Ultra, the 4060 can't even max the game out at 1080p. It's at 43 FPS. I mean, it's playable, but probably not how you'd choose to play it. And the 4070 would be 72% ahead, which is 74 FPS average. So very comfortable maxing the game out at 1080p. The 1% lows are 79% lead at 59 versus 33. So how would you actually play this game on either GPU? Well, the 4060 can be at native 1080p and drop down to the medium settings and be over 70 FPS, whereas the 4070 can just be at native 1080p ultra settings at 76. Now you can look at the differences between the two sides of the screen. I mean, there's definitely differences in the quality of the graphics there, but it's not like the game is hideous at medium settings or anything like that, right? So it's not a total disaster. Now, if we go to 1440p ultra settings, the 4070 is now able to average just 60 FPS in New Atlantis, so it is comfortable here, although you might want a higher frame rate, whereas the 4060 is now down in the 30s, hitting 34 FPS average here. That's a 76% advantage to the 4070, and the 1% lows are a 79% advantage at 50 versus 28. So what would you do? On the 4060, we would go all the way down to medium settings and upscale at the quality setting to get over a 70 FPS average, whereas the 4070, I'd probably go ultra settings and then kick on DLSS quality to get up into the upper 70s. Because, in a game with first-person shooter style combat, I'd probably like being up in the 70 FPS range as opposed to just hugging the 60 line. So again, getting upscaling on both, but medium versus ultra graphics settings. What about Alan Wake 2, another one of the most graphically demanding new games? At the 1080p high preset, we're seeing 76 FPS versus 45, giving the 4070 a 69 nice percent average uplift, although the 1% lows are even more at 58 versus 32. And it's possible we're right up against the VRAM, the 8 gigabytes of VRAM on the 4060. If you look at the stats counters, and this game can be VRAM hungry. So how would you play the game? On the 4060, you could go all the way down to low settings and use DLSS quality in order to just match the frame rate that you're getting on the 4070 at 1080p native with high settings. So again, we're now getting roughly the same frame rate experience, but you're getting significantly lower graphics settings and upscaling on the 4060. So what about 1440p? At 1440p high settings, the 4070 is able to hit 54 FPS average, which is giving it an 86% lead over the 29 FPS on the 4060, and it's doubling the performance in the 1% lows at 42 versus 21. Notice the VRAM usage indicators on the 4070 saying that we're probably trying to go beyond 8 gigabytes here, and that most likely contributes to the stuttery mess on the 4060's 1% lows. So how would you play the game at 1440p? I'd probably go low settings DLSS quality on the 4060 to achieve around 60 frames per second. The 4070 can achieve around, but a little bit below 60 FPS at 1440p native high settings. So basically maxing it out, but without ray tracing, no upscaling needed at 1440p on the 4070. So pretty big difference in what you're able to achieve on the two GPUs. So what if we went ahead and did try out some ray tracing? Well, if you already at the high preset and then you kick on the ray tracing high preset, even with quality level upscaling, the 4060 is only hitting 28 FPS. The 4070 is hitting 53, which gives it an 89% lead, and it's more than doubling the performance in the 1% lows. And again, if you look at the green memory line, we're well beyond 8 gigabytes of VRAM here, explaining the large percentage differences. So how would you do ray tracing in this game? Well, on the 4060, it's kind of out of the question. You could go DLSS quality RT low, and you're still only in the upper 30s, even with DLSS quality at 1080p. The 4070 could be 1440p DLSS performance, high settings with RT high, so maxing things out, but with a lot of upscaling at 1440p resolution, and you're getting better frame rates. But honestly, they're both a little weak for the kind of path tracing type full ray tracing stuff going on in Alan Wake 2. Another path tracing showcase here would be Cyberpunk RT Overdrive at 1080p, even with DLSS quality. The 4060 is only hitting 38 FPS. Whereas the 4070 is hitting 67. I don't love upscaling at 1080p, but the 4070 is certainly giving a much, much more usable frame rate to take that sacrifice on the upscale. Whereas you can also kick on frame generation. Achieving 60 FPS through frame generation isn't really a great experience in my opinion. Some people in my comment section say they're good with it though, so I'm showing the results. You can do it. The 4070 is hitting 111 FPS though with DLSS 3 quality plus frame generation. So a significant advantage there, and it's at a much more comfortable baseline. So if you're going to use ray tracing in this game, I think on the 4060, I would turn off RT Overdrive. You could go RT Reflections off of the normal Ultra preset with DLSS quality and frame generation. Now you're hitting over 100, although through frame generation, so keep that in mind. Whereas the 4070 could go, if you're going to go DLSS quality and frame generation, you can use the full RT Overdrive mode. So definitely differences of experience there. Now, if you turn off all the ray tracing stuff at 1080p Ultra, we see the 4070 has 56% lead, which is more like what you saw in launch reviews, right? Because when you're not VRAM constrained and you're not using ray tracing, it is kind of a 56-ish% uplift over the 4060. At 117 versus 75. In the 1% lows, we're at a 50% advantage, 81 versus 54. Now, if we move up to 1440p, again at the ultra settings, the 4070 is still good for 74 FPS, giving a 64% advantage over the 4060's 45 FPS. So again, notice as we increase the resolution, the 4070 pulls a bit more ahead from a relative percentage difference. And again, we're kind of seeing that over and over again, so I think that's the increased memory bandwidth helping out. The 1% lows are a 61% advantage. So how would you play the game at 1440p? On the 4060, you'd probably maybe drop all the way down to high settings and use quality level upscaling to now be up in the upper 80 FPS range. Whereas the 4070 could just play the game at ultra settings, maxed out non-ray traced, right? Ultra settings, native, no upscaling. Now you're only in the 70s here, but I think that's still very playable, and it's nice to not need to do the upscale. I do find upscaling artifacts noticeable in Cyberpunk in certain scenes. So avoiding it would be nice if you can. In Resident Evil 4 Remake, at 1080p max settings, the game is very VRAM hungry. This does include some ray tracing and a lot of VRAM usage. So we're seeing the 4070 take a 72% advantage in the averages and even the wider 80% lead in the 1% lows, where we can see some spikes on the frame time graph for the 4060 that we don't see on the 4070. So at 1080p, I'd probably on the 4060 go down to the prioritized graphics preset, whereas on the 4070, you can just keep everything maxed out. And that gets the VRAM under control, and we're both over 100 FPS on both GPUs. So I think it's worth doing that, especially since the ray tracing isn't really that impactful in this game. It's just kind of grainy looking RT reflections. I wish they'd allow the quality to increase or something. I don't know. Anyway, if you go up to 1440p max settings, we can now see the VRAM really punishing the 4060. The 4070 is more than twice as fast in the averages and 3 times as fast in the 1% lows, and we can see a spiky frame time graph on the 4060 and a nice smooth frame time graph on the 4070. Completely different experience, and again, it's because the max settings in this game are incredibly VRAM hungry. If we drop down to prioritize graphics settings, though, both GPUs are doing great. And this is probably how I'd actually play on both GPUs, because honestly, the ray tracing stuff isn't that impressive in this game. And so now the 4070 would get a nice high refresh rate experience with no upscaling at 130 FPS, and the 4060 would still be very comfortable at 74 FPS averages here. And again, both frame time graphs looking nice and smooth now. So Let's go ahead and take a look at Baldur's Gate 3, because I've been showing a lot of the most graphically demanding new games. Keep in mind that not every game is like that. Baldur's Gate at 1080p Ultra. One thing I'll point out is the 4070 could go faster here. It wasn't always 100% maxed out on the GPU, because you can get a lot of CPU limitations happening here in this city. Anyway, it's still 125 FPS versus 83, 51% advantage of the 4070. If we move up to 1440p resolution, we see the average uplift to 67% now at 102 versus 61, and we're more fully utilized on the GPUs, although the 1% lows are still kind of CPU constrained, with, again, Baldur's Gate City being most likely CPU constrained on most people's systems, I would imagine, because like I said, even on a 7800X 3D, it's very easy to run into CPU limits on good graphics cards. Another game that, again, doesn't... another use case for these graphics cards, I guess we could say, is what if you're just playing like multiplayer games with the graphics settings turned down? So CoD Modern Warfare 3, 1080p basic settings, we're seeing 283 FPS versus 177. So it is a 60% lead for the 4070, but both GPUs are able to achieve high refresh rate competitive experiences. If we move up to 1440p resolution, we're seeing a 209 FPS versus 124 FPS result. So again, both GPUs still doing very well. Although I think in competitive games, sometimes the difference between 200 and 120 is actually noticeable if you're pretty competitive at the game. So something to keep in mind. And then again, 69% advantage for the 4070. Nice on that one. And so let's go ahead and give some final thoughts on all of this, because like I said, part of the goal of this video was to look at this beyond a relative performance difference, right? It was to look at what sorts of, how will you actually experience games differently if you actually purchase these different GPUs. So I hope that was an interesting look here, right? Because if you're targeting 80 frames per second, you can do that, right? So it's not so much that neither of these that the GPU can't, like the 4060, can't achieve a higher frame rate in most of these games. But at what cost to the image quality settings? And showing you the footage, you can kind of see what that does, although do keep in mind that YouTube compression takes a heavy impact on what you're actually able to see in the video versus what you would see in person on your monitor. In person on a monitor, you see a lot more fine detail. There's less compression blocking. It's easier to see the issues with the upscaling and things like that. So anyway, showing you what I can in the format, I think it's pretty interesting. So I would say that despite the fact that the 4070 costs 86% more, but doesn't usually give you 86% better performance, meaning that the 4060 overall is a better performance per dollar, right? Or if you look at it cost per frame, however you want to look at that, the 4060 is offering better cost per frame. Just realize that with its, when we go beyond 8 gigabytes of VRAM, we can see that those differences can be actually fairly large percentage differences, a lot more than the 55% or so difference that you'll see if you're not VRAM constrained in a lot of titles, things like that. And in a lot of the latest games, we saw that playing out, right? But both GPUs can get the job done if you need them to. Just be aware, again, like I said, of the types of quality differences that you'll have to make in order to achieve the types of frame rates that you're looking for. So hopefully you guys found this video useful and or interesting. Huge thank you to channel members who click the join button to directly support the channel financially. That is absolutely huge. Totally understand that not everybody's in a place to do that. So also huge thank you to subscribers, commenters, viewers in general, all of that. And again, I hope all of you have an excellent day.